pawn d4, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn e6, knight c3, bishop b4, bishop g5, pawn h6, bishop h4, pawn c5, pawn d5, pawn d6, pawn e3, pawn e5, queen c2, knight b8, d7, knight g1, e2, knight f8, pawn a3, bishop takes c3, knight takes c3, knight g6, bishop g3, knight h5, bishop d3, knight e7, pawn f4, pawn takes f4, pawn takes f4, pawn f5, castles kingside, knight takes g3, pawn takes g3, castles kingside, rook a1, e1, bishop d7, rook e2, king h8, rook f1, e1, knight g8, knight d1, queen f6, queen c3, pawn a6, queen takes f6, knight takes f6, knight e3, knight g8, pawn b4, rook a8, c8, rook b1, pawn b5, pawn takes b5, pawn takes b5, pawn takes c5, rook takes c5, rook e2, b2, rook e8, bishop takes f5, rook takes e3, bishop takes d7, rook takes g3, rook takes b5, rook c2, bishop h3, rook takes a3, rook b8, rook takes h3, pawn takes h3, rook d2, rook d8, king h7, rook takes d6, knight e7, rook d7, knight f5, rook b6, knight e3, rook b6, b7, Knight f5. Rook b6. Knight e3. Pawn d6. Knight f5. King f1. Knight d4. Rook a7. Knight e6. Pawn f5. Knight c5. Pawn f6. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn e6. Knight c3. Bishop b4. Pawn e3. Castles kingside. Knight g1, e2. Pawn d5. Pawn a3. Bishop e7. Pawn takes d5. Pawn takes d5. Pawn g3. Knight b8, d7. Bishop g2. Knight b6. Castles kingside. Pawn a5. Pawn a4. Rook e8. Pawn f3. Pawn c5. Pawn g4. Pawn h6. Pawn b3. Bishop d7. Pawn takes c5. Bishop takes c5. Queen d3. Rook c8. Bishop d2. Bishop c6. Knight d4. Knight b6, d7. Rook a1, d1. Bishop a7. Knight c3, e2. Knight e5. Queen b1. Knight g6. Knight f5. Queen c7. Queen b2. King h7. King h1. Bishop b8. Knight e2, g3. Knight e5. Pawn f4. Knight d3. Queen d4. Knight b4. Pawn g5. Pawn takes g5. Pawn takes g5. Knight h5. Queen h4. Pawn g6. Knight takes h5. Queen takes h2. Queen takes h2. Bishop takes h2. Knight f6. King h8. Knight takes e8. Pawn takes f5. Bishop c3. King h7. Knight f6. King g6. King takes h2. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Knight f3. Pawn c5. Pawn e3. Pawn e6. Bishop d3. Pawn b6. Castles kingside. Bishop b7. Pawn b3. Bishop e7. Bishop b2. Castles kingside. Knight b1, d2. Knight c6. Pawn a3. Pawn takes d4. Pawn takes d4. Rook c8. Rook e1. Bishop d6. Pawn c4. Knight e7. Knight e5. Bishop b8. Bishop e2. Pawn d5. Bishop f3. Knight f5. Rook c1. Queen e7. Queen c2. Bishop d6. Knight d3. Bishop takes a3. Pawn c5. Bishop takes b2. Queen takes b2. Bishop a6. Queen c3. Pawn takes c5. Knight takes c5. Bishop b5. Pawn g3. Rook f8, d8. Bishop g2. Knight d6. Queen a5. Queen c7. Queen a3. Queen b6. Rook a1. Knight f5. Knight f3. Knight takes d4. Knight takes d4. Rook takes c5. Queen takes a7. Queen takes a7. Rook takes a7. Bishop e8. Rook b7. Rook d8, c8. Bishop f1. Rook c5, c7. Rook takes c7. Rook takes c7. Pawn b4. Rook b7. Pawn b5. Knight e4. Pawn f4. King f8. Rook c1. Knight d6. Rook c5. King e7. Bishop d3. Pawn h6. King f2. Bishop d7. Pawn f5. Knight e8. Pawn takes e6. Pawn takes e6. Rook c2. Knight c7. Knight c6. Bishop takes c6. Pawn takes c6. Rook b3. Bishop h7. King f7. Pawn h4. Pawn g6. Pawn h5. Pawn takes h5. Rook c1. King g7. Rook a1. Rook c3. Bishop d3. Rook takes c6. Rook a7. Pawn e5. Pawn c4. Knight f6. Pawn d4. Pawn e6. Knight c3. Pawn c5. Pawn d5. Pawn takes d5. Pawn takes d5. Pawn d6. Pawn e4. Pawn g6. Pawn f4. Bishop g7. Bishop d3. Castles kingside. Knight f3. Knight a6. Castles kingside. Knight c7. Pawn a4. Pawn b6. Rook e1. Pawn a6. Rook b1. Rook b8. Bishop d2. Rook e8. Pawn h3. Pawn b5. Pawn takes b5. Knight takes b5. Bishop takes b5. Pawn takes b5. Pawn b4. Knight d7. Queen c2. Queen c7. King h2. Bishop a6. Knight d1. Rook b8, c8. Rook c1. Queen b7. Queen b1. Rook c7. Knight e3. Knight f6. Pawn e5. Pawn takes e5. Pawn d6. Rook c7, c8. Pawn takes e5. Knight d7. Knight g4. Queen d5. Rook c1, d1. Queen e6. Bishop h6. Bishop b7. Bishop takes g7. King takes g7. Queen c1. Bishop takes f3. Queen h6. King h8. Knight f6. Knight takes f6. Pawn takes f6. Queen takes f6. Pawn d7. Bishop c6. Pawn takes e8. Pawn e4. Pawn c5. Knight f3. Pawn d6. Pawn d4. Pawn takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight f6. Knight c3. Pawn a6. Bishop g5. Pawn e6. Pawn f4. Bishop e7. Queen f3. Queen c7. Castles queenside. Knight b8, d7. Queen g3. Pawn h6. Bishop h4. Pawn g5. Pawn takes g5. Rook g8. Queen e1. Pawn takes g5. Bishop g3. Knight e5. Knight f3. Pawn b5. Pawn a3. Bishop d7. Queen d2, rook b8, queen d4, knight f6, g4, pawn h3, knight takes f3, pawn takes f3, knight e5, bishop e2, pawn a5, knight b1, pawn b4, pawn takes b4, pawn takes b4, pawn b3, bishop b5, bishop takes b5, rook takes b5, bishop takes e5, pawn takes e5, queen d3, rook a5, king d2, rook a2, king e2, queen takes c2, queen takes c2, rook takes c2, rook d2, rook c8, rook a2, king f8, knight d2, rook c3, rook a7, bishop c5, rook d7, rook e3, king d1, king g7, rook g1, rook a8, rook takes g5, king f6, rook g2, bishop d4, rook c7, bishop c3, pawn h4, rook a1, king c2, rook a2, king d1, rook d3, knight f3, pawn c5, pawn c4, pawn g6, pawn e4, bishop g7, pawn d4, pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, knight c6, bishop e3, knight h6, knight c3, castles kingside, bishop e2, pawn f5, pawn takes f5, bishop takes d4, bishop takes d4, knight takes F5, Bishop C5, Pawn D6, Bishop A3, Knight F5, D4, Castles kingside, Bishop F5, Rook C1, Queen D7, Knight D5, Rook F7, Pawn B3, Rook A8, F8, Bishop B2, Pawn E5, Pawn B4, Bishop E6, Bishop D3, Bishop G4, Pawn F3, Bishop takes F3, Pawn takes F3, Knight takes F3, King H1, Queen H3, Rook F2, Knight E1, Pawn D4, Knight F6, Pawn C4, Pawn E6, Knight C3, Bishop B4, Pawn E3, Pawn D5, Pawn A3, Bishop takes C3, Pawn takes C3, Castles kingside, Pawn takes D5, Pawn takes D5, Bishop D3, Pawn C5, Knight E2, Pawn B6, Castles kingside, Rook E8, Pawn F3, Bishop A6, Bishop C2, Knight C6, Rook F2, Queen C7, Pawn G4, Pawn takes D4, Pawn C3 takes D4, Bishop takes E2, Rook takes E2, Rook A8, C8, Queen D3, Pawn G6, Bishop A4, Rook E8, D8, Bishop D2, Queen B7, Bishop B5, Knight B8, Queen B3, Knight E8, Bishop E1, Knight D6, Bishop H4, Rook F8, Bishop D3, Rook f8, e8. Rook d1. King g7. Bishop g3. Knight c4. Pawn e4. King g8. Pawn a4. Knight d7. Pawn e5. Knight f8. Pawn f4. Knight e6. Bishop b1. Knight a5. Queen e3. Knight c4. Queen f2. Knight a3. Bishop a2. Queen d7. Rook d3. Knight c4. Pawn f5. Knight g5. Bishop f4. Knight e4. Queen h4. Queen takes a4. Pawn f6. Queen b4. Rook b3. Queen f8. Bishop h6. Knight takes e5. Bishop takes f8. Pawn e4. Pawn e5. Knight f3. Knight c6. Bishop b5. Pawn a6. Bishop a4. Knight f6. Queen e2. Pawn b5. Bishop b3. Bishop c5. Pawn c3. Castles kingside. Castles kingside. Pawn d6. Pawn d3. Bishop e6. Bishop g5. Queen e7. Bishop d5. Queen d7. Bishop takes f6. Pawn takes f6. Pawn d4. Pawn takes d4. Bishop takes c6. Pawn d3. Queen takes d3. Queen takes c6. Knight b1, d2. King h8. Knight d4. Queen d7. Pawn a4. Rook a8, b8. Pawn takes b5. Pawn takes b5. Queen f3. Bishop takes d4. Pawn takes d4. Queen e7. Rook f1, c1. Pawn c5. Rook a7. Queen takes a7. Queen takes f6. King g8. Rook c3. Rook f8, e8. Rook g3. King f8. Pawn d5. Rook a8. Pawn h4. Queen d7. Rook g7. Queen d8. Queen h6. King e7. Queen takes e6. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn c5. Pawn d5. Pawn e6. Knight c3. Pawn takes d5. Pawn takes d5. Pawn d6. Pawn e4. Pawn g6. Knight f3. Bishop g7. Bishop d3. Castles kingside. Castles kingside. Pawn a6. Pawn a4. Bishop g4. Pawn h3. Bishop takes f3. Queen takes f3. Knight b8, d7. Bishop f4. Queen c7. Queen e2. Rook f8, e8. Bishop h2. Rook a8, c8. Bishop c4. Knight b6. Pawn a5. Knight takes c4. Queen takes c4. Knight d7. Pawn f4. Pawn b5. Pawn takes b6. Knight takes b6. Queen takes a6. Bishop takes c3. Pawn takes c3. Rook takes e4. Rook a1, b1. Knight c4. Rook b7. Queen d8. Rook a1. Queen h4. Rook b7, b1. Rook c8, e8. King h1. Queen h5. Queen c6. King g7. Pawn f5. Rook e2. Pawn f6. King h6. Queen d7. Queen takes d5. Bishop f4. Pawn g5. Queen g4. King g6. Pawn h4. Pawn h5. Queen takes g5. Queen takes g5. Pawn takes g5. Rook e2, e4. Rook f1. Knight e3. Rook f3. Pawn d5. Rook a5. Knight g4. Rook a1. Rook e2. Rook f3, f1. Rook c2. Rook a1, c1. Rook e8, e2. Rook takes c2. Rook takes c2. Rook f3. Knight f2. King g1. Knight e4. Bishop e5. King takes g5. King h2. Knight f2. Bishop d6. Knight e4. Bishop e5. Rook e2. Bishop c7. Knight f2. Bishop b6. Knight g4. King g3. Rook e1. Rook d3. Pawn h4. Pawn d4. Knight f6. Pawn c4. Pawn c5. Pawn d5. Pawn e6. Knight c3. Pawn takes d5. Pawn takes d5. Pawn d6. Knight f3. Pawn g6. Knight d2. Bishop g7. Pawn g3. Castles kingside. Bishop g2. Knight e8. Castles kingside. Knight d7. Knight c4. Knight e5. Queen b3. Knight takes c4. Queen takes c4. Pawn a6. Bishop f4. Pawn b5. Queen d3. Pawn f5. Queen d2. Knight f6. Rook f1, e1. Rook a7. Pawn a3. Knight g4. Pawn h3. Knight e5. Bishop takes e5. Bishop takes e5. Pawn f4. Bishop g7. Pawn e4. Bishop d4. King h2. Pawn g5. Pawn takes g5. Pawn f4. Pawn takes f4. Rook takes f4. Knight e2. Rook f2. Rook f1. Rook a7, f7. Rook takes f2. Rook takes f2. Rook f1. Queen f8. Queen c1. Rook takes f1. Queen takes f1. Queen takes f1. Bishop takes f1. Bishop takes b2. Pawn a4. Pawn takes a4. Knight f4. Pawn a3. Bishop c4. Bishop d7. King g3. Bishop b5. Bishop a2. Pawn c4. Knight g2. Pawn c3.